Hi everybody and welcome back. It's good to be with you again. Although sitting on my own here last week, I did feel a little bit lonely. So this week I've got a couple of my Norwegian buddies with me. And let me introduce you. On my left is this gentleman is a real Norwegian Viking. His name is Geir Rovik. Some of you may notice him, may have met him. He comes to all our naming ceremonies, and he brings his axe with him, and he cuts the rope that releases the bottle of aquavit that smashes against the hull of the ship during the naming ceremony. And he builds authentic Viking longships, and I photographed him. I was lucky enough to sail with him once on one of these ships, and this is a photo I took of him when he was at the helm. Anyway, he's a great guy. And here on my right is Norway's most famous ram, whose name is Canel Snur. Those of you who've been on the ocean ships will have seen this picture, I'm sure. Canel Snur means cinnamon bun in Norwegian, obviously just because of the horns, the shape of the magnificent horns resembles a Norwegian cinnamon bun. And sadly, a couple of years ago, Canel Snur died. I photographed him on a beautiful farm in the middle of Norway, and he had once his duties as a ram were over, he was retired. But he had a long and happy retirement because of this photo. The people on the farm normally once would have had him slaughtered when he was no use to them, but because they'd had postcards made, and they had car stickers made, and their logo was this picture. So Canel Snur was allowed to live on, and he died of old age. So last week, quite a lot of questions came in, and I thought today I would just try and go through some of those. And then I'll maybe talk to you a little bit about the kind of photography I do, the kind of travel photography I do for Viking. So questions. Danielle in Michigan. Danielle asked. She says, "I love the photo of the Roman ruler positioned in a niche above a car with a cover on it." So I think on your screen you should have the photo that Danielle is referring to, and I'm delighted that you noticed it, Danielle, because I like it too, and because I think it illustrates to me exactly the kind of photography, the kind of travel photography I enjoy most, which is to wander around the back streets of a city. In this case, it's Rome, and to get completely lost and just see what comes up. And I find nearly always something interesting does present itself. Fred in Arizona. Hi, Fred. He asked me last week, any suggestions for dramatic landscapes? So often they are disappointing. Well, Fred, you have some great possibilities for dramatic landscapes in Arizona. I would say that successful landscape photography requires a mix of great light and careful composition and a lot of time. And it's usually the result of a lot of careful planning, followed by a lot of walking and waiting. And generally speaking, because there are always exceptions, Fred, you could try to give depth to your images by having some kind of foreground interest that will then lead your eye into the main subject of the photo. And try things like filters. I use a lot of filters in landscape photography. When I say filters, I mean neutral density filters and polarizing filters and graduated filters. They're all worth experimenting with. So try that out. And and most importantly, Fred, remember that what you leave out of an image is almost, I'd say, almost as important as what you put in it. So put in lots of edge patrol to make sure you're not including any distracting elements that you really should leave out. Yawn, what have we got here? Yawn in Oslo asks, what is your most memorable wildlife photo? I think this shot, which is on your screen now, of a polar bear taken in Svalbard, up in the Arctic Circle, would be one of them. The reason I chose this one is because seeing a polar bear in the wild is such an unforgettable experience. You can really sense the power and the dominance they have over their habitat. And also, I really don't like pictures of wild animals where they're made to look all cute and cuddly. So I love the fact this bear's coat is all dirty with mud he's been rolling in. Another choice would be these king penguins, this photo was taken in the Falkland Islands last year. They're such fantastically beautiful creatures, and to see them waddling around on a beach of pure white sand was really quite special. Melanie in Louisiana, what is your favorite locale to photograph? Melanie, off the top of my head, Vietnam, Japan, Italy, anywhere in those three countries, although not necessarily in that order. Actually, Melanie, I'm really looking forward to coming to your part of the world when Viking starts cruising down the Mississippi. That's going to be great. And also, I think around the end of next year, the new expedition ship will be heading towards Antarctica, and I can't wait for that. From Noel in Malibu. Hi, Noel. How much planning is involved to catch the perfect light for your subjects? I say that if possible, Noel, the more planning you can do, the better. The better your chances of success. Knowing the times of the sunrise and the sunset would be a pretty good place to start. On my phone, I have a compass app that tells me where east and west are and how high or low the sun is going to be between those 2 points. And I also use a different app when photographing the northern lights, which gives me an idea of how strong they'll be and at what time they're likely to show themselves. Tony in Springfield, Illinois says, is it possible to make a pinhole lens from a camera with an interchangeable lens? Yes, it is, Tony, it absolutely is. I've done it myself. It's a lot of fun. What you do basically is, here's my camera. You just take off the lens and you put a piece of foil, you tape a piece of foil over the hole here, and with a pin, you make a pinhole, which is why it's called a pinhole camera. And it's a lot of fun. You might want to use a tripod because the exposures will be long, but give it a go, and you can get some interesting results. So last week ended with me we were in 2012. I was living in France without any work due to a banking crisis and the resulting recession. And I was starting to get a little desperate. By chance, a friend of mine, or actually it was a friend of mine, who worked in the Viking London office, suggested my name as a possible photographer for an up-and-coming naming ceremony in Amsterdam. And I think what swung it for me was this photo. Well, not so much the photo as the fact that it was on the cover of Time magazine. Viking had checked me out and seen it on my website. It looks a little like a composite of two separate images, but I promise you it isn't. The backstory to this is that the then French president, Jacques Chirac, had ordered the building of a new museum in Paris, which was to be dedicated to the history and the art of indigenous peoples. And for the opening of this museum, all the best Aboriginal artists from around the world were flown in. And the man on the cover, his name is John Marundrell, he was one of them. So Viking sent me to Amsterdam to cover the naming ceremony for the new river longships. I'm sure many of you have sailed on them in Europe. And for me, this was the beginning of what is now 8 years of more or less constant travel photography. Now, like most things in life, good photography requires patience and concentration. So let's have a look at some examples of what I'm talking about. This was an early morning shoot in the gardens of the Caserta Palace in Naples. There was this really gorgeous early morning light, and I was drawn to this rather lovely statue. And as I walked around it, I noticed that from a particular narrow angle, the sun just highlighted all the spiders' webs that had been left there overnight. And I think there's a pleasing contrast of textures between the delicacy of those spiders' webs and the smoothness of the marble statues, and then the roughness of the stone behind. And here's an example of what the difference that being patient and waiting can make. This is the convent of the Capuchin in Guatemala, and it's a fairly straightforward photo. What attracted me initially were these marvelous fat columns and the way they contrast with the roof arches. You can just make out a figure sitting at the back of the shot, but she's in shadow and not really adding anything much to the picture. So I decided to wait a little for someone to walk into the frame, which would give a sense of scale and add a central point of interest to the composition. And sure enough, before long, somebody did. And hopefully you'll agree that this makes a better photo. Another slightly similar shot, this time in Bilbao. The presence of the people, I think, adds to the composition, but also allows us to imagine ourselves in this square walking around and enjoying the early morning light. Enjoying the light. After all the word photography comes from the Latin and does literally mean writing or drawing with light. I guess in my ideal world, I'd probably really only photograph from dawn till about mid-morning, and then from late afternoon until darkness. So what to do when the light is either flat and dull, which it often is, or harsh and overhead in the middle of the day? Well, shooting inside is one possibility. Maybe visit that indoor market where these chilies in Brunei were taken, or go inside a church. This one is in Ravenna, or sometimes just the ground beneath your feet. This is a street in Saint-Paul-de-Vence in the south of France. You can see that it's been raining, and the dampness really brings out the colors of those pebbles. Or again, here in the streets of San Juan with the beautiful blue stones. Incidentally, you probably know this. These were made from waste slag you get when iron ore is refined, which was used as ballast for ships in the 16th century when they came over empty from Spain before filling up with sugar for the return journey. But talking about bad weather, last year I took myself off to Iceland and then the Faroe Islands. Now, if I thought the weather in Iceland had been bad, well, the Faroe Islands weather was extreme. When I arrived, I went to pick up my hire car from the airport, check it from the airport hire car place, and the lady behind the desk gave me a strange look and said, "I wouldn't go out tonight if I were you." So I took her advice, and she was right. A massive storm blew through, and the rain lashed against my hotel window all night. And for the next week, it rained and it blustered every day. But between the rain showers, there would sometimes be marvelous, strong, piercing light, which combined with a dark, stormy sky, made for some really dramatic photography. Here's some more examples. And with I think we should have a photo of a sheep now. With this photo of a sheep, I deliberately framed the image to exclude its head and legs, because I wanted to emphasize the effects of the wind and the rain and how it made the sheep's wool all knotted and tangled. Another stormy picture here. In the Viking world, the raven is a magical creature, believed to be the ears and eyes of the chief Viking god, Odin. And two of them, two ravens, their names were Hugin and Munin, flew around the world bringing back information to Odin. And if you look carefully, you can see them on the ocean ships. They're there in the Winter Garden. Incidentally, Vikings used ravens as navigation aid on their long voyages. If they were released and did not return, that was a sign that land was not far away. Kind of early GPS system. So really, I'd go far as to say that there is no such thing as bad weather for photography. It doesn't need to be sunny. It's just a question of adapting the choices you make to the circumstances around us. So if you find yourself on a cruise and the ship is staying in port overnight, then you have the opportunity of one dusk and one dawn. And these are probably the best times to get out there with your camera. This is Bilbao again, the amazing Guggenheim Museum, which I just loved, turned orange by this strong dawn light. And the same museum on the same day, this time at dusk, the stormy sky giving a completely different feeling. Dawn in particular is a favorite time for me because people are still in bed and you can have a city or a landscape more or less to yourself. This is early morning in Venice. And at the end of the day, the setting sun on the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. I'm often asked about one of my favorite cities to photograph, and Florence would definitely be one of them. And so with this city, Naples at sunrise. And again at sunrise, the old bridge in beautiful Lucerne in Switzerland. Now, part of the photography that I do for Viking involves aerial shooting from helicopters. You may be thinking that since drones came on the market, why would we go to the expense of using a helicopter? Just drone it instead. And we do a lot. For example, this was taken with a drone, the Viking Sea leaving Ancona shipyard for her maiden voyage. But whilst drones have been a real game changer, they do have their limitations. Helicopters can stay up for longer and go further, go higher and go faster. They have a much greater range. Also, if you can use bigger and better camera equipment for higher image quality, and they're not so vulnerable to the wind and rain. Basically, helicopters are like big flying tripods, but they are expensive, and that just adds another layer of stress to the shoot. And just as stressful is the weather, because the moment the helicopter takes off, the money clock starts ticking. And there's no refund if it starts raining or if the fog rolls in. So the first aerial shoot I did was in Venice, which is a pretty good place to start. As always, it was a door-off shoot, which meaning that I'm sitting in the rear of the helicopter on the left side, wearing a harness to make sure I didn't fall out. There's usually a safety talk first. And the bit I really pay attention to is how to release the attached harness which clips onto my back. Because if you unfortunately crash land on water, and we're often shooting over water, you could easily be pulled down by under the water by the sinking helicopter. And this has happened and people have died like this. Anyway, seeing Venice and the lagoon from the air was amazing. We flew around a bit first, planning the angles we wanted while we waited for the Viking Sea to sail in. What usually works best over a city is a stacked up type image where you have foreground interest and then ship and then background. But there are always a lot of restrictions about where you can and can't go and how low down you can fly. It can be really frustrating sometimes. If you're lucky and you get a good pilot who can visualize the shot you want and get you there, then that makes a big difference. I remember in New York one time, we had a pilot who thought he'd done it all and seen it all and just generally knew better than we did what we wanted. After we had filmed the arrival of the ship, we still had 20 minutes on the clock. So the pilot asked if we wanted to fly over Manhattan. Well, who wouldn't? At one point, and I think he was showing off, he performed a very tight anti-clockwise turn. And as the helicopter banked over on its side, I found myself staring down vertically into the streets of Manhattan, a long way below, just praying that there wasn't a loose camera or lens or anything else that was going to roll out of the helicopter and then kill someone down in Times Square, because it so easily could have happened. This isn't me, by the way, but from the questions you sent in after my last talk last week, I know that some of you out there would like me to talk a little bit more about the technical side of things. For example, Alan Beshany from Colorado asked if I could talk more about equipment and cameras and lenses. And Alan, I'm sorry if I disappoint you. It's just that I'm not a very techie photographer. And the guy or girl down at your local camera store will almost certainly know more about that kind of thing than I do. Basically, I just know how to use the equipment I own. For most of my life, I've been a Nikon user, and that's still the case. It's not that there's anything particularly amazing about Nikon cameras over, say, Canon. They both make pretty good cameras, but I never really saw the need or the expense in changing over from one to the other. Over the last few years, though, I've become more and more convinced that less really is more. What I mean is I just don't want to be lugging around heavy camera gear all day anymore, especially when climbing up the 463 steps to the top of the Duomo in Florence, or crossing a plateau in Normandy. So a few years ago, I bought my first mirrorless camera, which is it's a Fuji. It's small, it's light, it's unobtrusive, and it's just generally less intimidating than the big Nikon. And it can be totally silent, which is great, all of which are important if you're taking photos like this. This is a temple in Bangkok, and I was very close behind these two boys, and I was sure that the instant they heard the click of a camera shutter, they would have turned around and the moment would be gone. Another piece of equipment I rely on a lot is a light carbon fiber monopod. As you've probably guessed, this photo was taken in the Shetlands. There's the obvious reason for using a monopod, which is extra stability, to avoid camera shake as well if you're using slow shutter speed. But even with a high shutter speed, I find it helps to maintain constant composition, especially when shooting portraits, for example. And once in Budapest, I found another use for a monopod. I was alone in a park photographing the famous chain bridge across the Danube just after sunset, when this drunk guy staggered out of the bushes and then tried to mug me. But after a couple of light whacks from my monopod, he gave up and tottered back off into the darkness. Now, quite a lot of the time at Viking, for marketing purposes, we use talent, professional models who are pretending to be real cruise guests, enjoying themselves on a Viking ship. And some are better than others, but their job is a lot harder than you might imagine. The really good ones can make everything just seem completely natural and effortless. The not so good ones can usually be found in the souvenir shop when they're supposed to be on set. But sometimes I'll see a real picture possibility, and with no talent available on board ship, I'm forced to use real people like you, ladies and gentlemen. And that was the case with this photo. I don't know how many of you here have ventured into the infinity pool on the ocean ships for a swim. If you have, I hope you'll agree it's pretty special. And I remember thinking, he was a possibility for a lovely photo. So with this shot in mind, I asked a couple of guests on board if they would be willing to help me out and pose for the photo. And they were game for it and immediately went and changed into their swimming costumes. But to get the shot I wanted, I knew I'd have to be in the pool with them, with the camera almost at water level. What I hadn't quite realized was just how deep the water is in that pool. If I was to stand on the bottom of the pool with the water would come just over my head. So I knew I needed something to stand on, but I had no idea what. But by pure chance at that moment, the captain came by, and seeing my dilemma, he threw one of the loungers into the pool. Well, he was the captain, and I wasn't going to argue with him. So I placed the lounger in the center of the pool, and I was then able to stand on it and have enough height above the water to take the shot without ruining my cameras. And then the final image, was used by marketing as an advertisement, much to the delight of the couple in the picture. So that photo of the couple in the pool was tricky to take, but there was no cheating involved, no compositing. But occasionally, very occasionally, you do have to cheat a little bit when it's not possible to get it in camera. Or in the case of this image, actually quite a lot. Here's what happened. Viking said to me, "Alastair, can you go up to the north of Norway and photograph the ship with the northern lights above it?" Sure, I said. I mean, what could be easier? Except that northern lights don't just switch on and off, which is, of course, part of their magic. And the ship also has an itinerary it must stick to. So it very quickly became obvious to me that the chances of having the ship sailing in a suitable location with the northern lights visible overhead was practically zero. So the compromise I made with my conscience was to photograph the two separately, but in the same location. So after several lengthy meetings with the captain and the pilot, it was agreed that on its route from Tromsø to Alta, right up at the top of Norway there, the ship would take a diversion into a fjord called Oxfjord, where it would perform a very slow 360-degree pirouette for the photos. In the meantime, I had hired a local fisherman who had a small motorboat, and for a fee was willing to take me out to meet the ship at 3 o'clock in the morning. As we waited on the quayside for the ship to appear, the temperature, I think it was about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 14 degrees centigrade. So my ungloved hand I could barely manipulate the controls on the camera. And eventually the ship arrived at the entrance to the fjord, and doing a really slow 5 knots came crawling in towards us. It felt like it took forever. Now for the photo, it was obviously important for me to see the ship, but also to see some of the mountainous landscape surrounding it. So technically everything was against me. It was pitch dark. I was on a moving boat, photographing a moving ship and shivering with cold. So my first test exposure looked like this. This was taken at a 15th of a second with the lens at maximum aperture and the ISO set to a noisy 6,400. And at this point, I thought things would never work out and we would just have to give up. But as the ship crept closer, it became just possible to make out a slight pre-dawn light coming into the sky. So still very dark, but I was able to up my shutter speed to a 20th of a second and half the ISO to 3,200, although it still doesn't look that great or anywhere near it. But with the light in the sky intensifying, I knew that if I could just persuade the captain to keep the ship in place for a little longer, maybe it would work out. But by now it's 4:30 in the morning, and there's just enough available light for me to shoot at a 60th of a second and to bring the ISO down to 2000. But what with all the bobbing around so much on the little boat that I was on, all my pictures were still getting blurred. So I decided the only thing to do, the only option I had, was to just hold down the shutter button and shoot image after image after image after image, in the hope that one would coincide with a moment of stillness on our little boat. And that's what happened. A few frames were sharp enough to be usable, and finally we could go back to the shore and warm up. 2 days later, in the same location, but not on a boat this time, I was rewarded with a beautiful display of northern lights. And later in my electronic darkroom, I combined the two images for the final result that you see here. So yes, I did cheat a little. It's an exception, but I think the result is, and this is the important bit, I think the result is still faithful to what you can expect to experience on a Northern Lights cruise. Now, to those of you who sent in photos with the theme of isolation, many thanks for that. It was really great to see what you've been getting up to. I'm going to just give a little shout out to, here we go, Nancy, Rose, Susan, Harry, Doris, Mike, Peter, Catherine, Crystal, Noel, Alan, Sue, and Bill. Yeah, thank you for your contribution, and I greatly enjoy seeing what you've been doing. There's one here from Greg Solms, which kind of sums up what I'm living through right now. It's a tiny ladybug all alone on a beautiful tulip, which is a sort of metaphor for how I'm feeling about my garden. It's never looked better or more beautiful than it is now, but there's no one else to see it. So let me have a look at, see if we've got some questions. I think we may have. Okay, here's a good one. Bill in New Mexico. Gosh, it'd be nice to be in New Mexico right now. Bill, what is your asks, what is your recommendation for a traveler lens if you are only going to take one? Wow. Good question. I guess if you're only going to take one lens, well, you could take a zoom. Is that what? Maybe that's cheating a little bit. But I'd go for something. I mean, this is my go-to wide-angle lens. It's a 17-35 f2.8 Nikon lens, and that covers a lot. It's a little heavy, but it's a great lens. Or you could be a purist, Bill, and just take a 50mm, which a 50mm lens is the closest focal length to our eye, to what we see. And it's, for example, Cartier-Bresson, the great French photographer Cartier-Bresson, the founder of Magnum, really would only use a 50mm lens. So you could try that. It would be interesting to try that. But if you wanted to maybe be a little more generous with yourself, try a wide-angle zoom. That's what I would go for. Carla Bundy in Louisiana, Mandeville, Louisiana. Hi, Carla. Do you prefer subject shot in sunrise or sunset? Is there a difference? Yeah, there's a difference. The light's not quite the same temperature. It's a little bluer, it's a little colder in sunrise and a little warmer at sunset. I prefer sunrise. You know why? Because I go back to what I said earlier on. I just love it when you're being in a city, or particularly a city when it's empty. It's just really special. Actually, as I'm saying that, I just realized that all cities are really empty right now. So it'd be great to see them full again. But yeah, sunrise in a city is it's always a special time for me. What have we got? Denise Lascos in Orlando. Best sailing to see the Northern Lights, and what months are best to view them? Well, there is a Northern Lights cruise, Denise, which will pretty much guarantee that you see the Northern Lights, and it's I don't have the itinerary in front of me, but it's over I think it's January, February, March, that sort of time. Is probably when you're best to go, and you go up to Tromsø, up in the north of Norway. And I mean, every time I've been up there, it's not always been spectacular, but it's always been pretty good. There's always been Northern Lights. Joanna in New York. Hi, Joanna. Can you tell me what is the film we are watching with the man digging in his garden? Yeah, Joanna, I'll be straight with you here. That's me in my garden. And you know, when this whole shutdown thing started, I kind of kidded myself that it's not going to last that long, so there's no point in creating a vegetable garden. And then after a while, I thought, okay, actually, this is going to go on for a while. So I thought, right, I'm going to build a vegetable. I'm going to dig a vegetable garden. And I shot that little bit of film, and I shot it. I sent it to my wife, and this is the danger of the internet. Somehow it ended up on the Viking.TV site, but I hope it's not bothering you. Maybe I'll make another one later where I can show you. It's all growing out there right now, and in a couple of months it'll look a lot better. So bear with me. I'm just reading questions to you. Alex Smith in Seattle. Alex, I love Seattle. I had a great sale once in Seattle. What a lovely place. So Alex says, have you ever considered selling prints of your photos in one of the shops on board the ships? They would make a wonderful memory of our Viking experience on board. Alex, yes, and yes again. I would love to sell prints on board the ship. And in fact, I have had some conversations about this lately, and I think I can't promise it, but I can probably pretty much guarantee that when you're next cruising, that there will be hopefully some very high quality, beautiful black and white prints available on the onboard shop. Fingers crossed. I think that'll probably happen. Good. Okay, so coming up now on the screen, I'm going to show some of the photos that you've been sending in with the isolation theme, and it's been great spending this time with you. I'd just like to thank you and for watching, and I wish you all good light. Thank you.